welcome and thank you all for coming here tonight. Good to meet you, I have to script now, I'm getting old, so I can't live things like I used to. Let me begin by putting on my glasses, and I would like to thank, first of all those who have made this possible. I want to thank Amy, Liz, and everybody here at the Canby Tap House for hosting us. It's always nice to have a roof over your head. I wish to thank the University of Montana that provides a home and so much support for the Irish Studies program. Specific to that program, I wish to thank the Friends of Irish Studies for their continuing support for the Irish Studies program. If you're not a member of the Friends of Irish Studies, I suggest that you join. They have a nice little revolution going here in Montana, and they need support. Revolutions need support. I would also like to thank Sam and Julie Borders for their support for the Irish History program. Sam made a wise decision many years ago to take a course in history from Dave Emmons, who happens to be here, and he's never looked back. If you haven't read Dave Emmons' book on the Bute Irish, you should. It's absolutely incredible. Now, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce John Borgonovo to you this evening. Dr. Neil Buttimer, who developed the Irish Language and Law program at UCC, with Judge Malloy from the Federal Chambers here, who happens to be here tonight. You may be aware of the Irish Language and Law students that have been coming out here for the past 15 years, harassing us. There's one of them just there by the window. You could write a book on the Language and Law program. We'll get back to that later. But it was Dr. Neil Buttimer introduced me to John, and it was during that first meeting I realised just how knowledgeable he was when talking about revolutionary politics in Ireland. Now, this surprised me, as John is a native of San Francisco and primarily of Italian descent, as his name suggests. Now, I don't know if he had the good fortune or the misfortune to attend Sacred Heart Catholic High School in San Francisco, but had he not gone there, it is unlikely that he would be here talking to us tonight. It was at Sacred Heart that he came into contact with what he called the Sunset Irish, the children of working-class Irish who were working night and day to provide their miscreant children with a Catholic education. And these boys were bowsies. I lived in the Sunset. John entered high school at a time when tensions were running high in Ireland. This was the early 80s, in the time of the hunger strikes. John and his classmates decided to visit the British consulate in San Francisco when the recently departed Queen Elizabeth stopped on an official visit. I don't think they were going up to welcome her to San Francisco, but when they got up there, the sight that greeted them was not that of the Queen, but of a large group of Irish demonstrators dressed in black and protesting British injustice in Ireland. Now, there are times, people and events that we all experience that can change the course of our lives. This event sent John on his journey into Irish history, and we have all got to be grateful for that. John earned a BA in History at the University of Oregon and then went to University College Cork, where he completed an MA in Irish History in 1997. Being the good San Francisco boy that he is, he returned to California and to a career in, guess what? Computers. He lasted 6 years before returning to his real passion, Irish history. He published his first book, Florence and Josephine O'Donoghue's War of Independence, A Destiny That Shapes Our Ends, in 2006. He updated and published his MA thesis, Spies, Informers, and the Anti-Sinn Féin Society, The Intelligence War in Cork City, 1920 to 1921, in 2007. This was followed by the Battle of Cork, July to August 1922, and by the Dynamics of War and Revolution, Cork City, 1916, 1918, and 2013. John has also been the editor of the Atlas of the Irish Revolutionary War, which has been the most popular history book, the book that more people have bought than any other published history book in Irish publishing history. It's an absolute remarkable book. He has contributed numerous journal articles and has been very prominent in organising commemorations and celebrations of Irish historical events and figures locally and nationally. He is one of the most well-known public historians in Ireland and maintains a very close relationship with community historians and groups. And I know this personally. I went to St. Joseph People, where my people are buried going back 300 years or 200 years. And I met these two old codgers who didn't know who I was, didn't know who my brother was, even though they were from the same parish as these fellas. They knew who my grandparents were, but they knew who John Borgonovo was. So they knew the boy from San Francisco, and they didn't know us, who've been in that part for God knows how many years. Anyway, now ironically, John's study of Irish history has brought him back to America. He is one of a growing number of scholars who recognise that the revolution in Ireland from 1850 to 1921 took place under the shadow of Irish America. And the 5 great strongholds of Irish American nationalism were Boston, New York, Chicago, Montana, and San Francisco. He is here tonight not to talk about the Irish of Ireland, but the Irish of America, and more specifically, the Irish of the West, your people. So please join me in giving Dr. John Borgonovo a very hearty Irish Montana welcome. Forth the road, John.
That's some introduction. Please back a little bit. Get my logistics. I'm a little reluctant. I know how much you guys in Montana like to be lectured by Californians. So I'm aware of that. And as Trailock said, I'm from San Francisco. I wouldn't have identified myself as Irish American. My ethnic background, I grew up in an Italian neighborhood. I have an Italian surname. My grandparents were Italian immigrants. My dad didn't speak English until he went to school, until he went to kindergarten. As Trailock said, I went to a Catholic high school, and I became friends with these Sunset Irish who were their own tribe. I do know something about being, from my dad, I know something about the immigrant experience and the idea that when your parents are immigrants, you don't take your identity as an American for granted. It's often the grandchildren who feel a lot more comfortable are able to do that. And kind of these questions of dual loyalty can be quite uncomfortable for them. I do have some Irish in me, though. My mother's from LeGrand, Oregon, and her mother was raised on a sheep ranch by Irish immigrants near the town of Heppner. And if any know about Heppner and Condon and Pendleton, there's a whole Irish pocket there, just like there are these Irish pockets kind of dotted all over the West. And again, we often think of the big Irish communities in places like Boston and Philadelphia and Chicago, Butte or San Francisco, but there are these other just pockets that popped up, oftentimes weren't sustained by continued immigration and kind of died out again, although the footprint is still there, mainly through their descendants and some of the place names as well. My mom's Irishness, and you know, she was entirely different from the San Francisco Irish. She was Oregon Irish, and her Irish cousins, Irish American cousins, were cowboys and ranchers. And when she grew up, she was very much aware of her Irishness because it was associated with her Catholicism. And when she grew up in LeGrand, there was pronounced anti-Catholic sentiment in that town. She said she felt like she had a big R for Roman Catholic branded on her forehead. And she grew up, rooting for Notre Dame football on Saturday, and Irishness meant Catholicism. And one thing I want to point out is that different Irish communities are different from each other everywhere. The San Francisco Irish experience is different from the Butte experience. The Chicago Irish experience is different from the Kansas City Irish. They all have their own cultural, social, economic, physical geography that makes them a bit different. They have some commonalities, but there's a lot of nuance there. And I'm sure that the Helena Irish are different from the Billings Irish, and God help, I think the Butte Irish are a nation amongst themselves. But this is quite common, that you develop these slightly different regional identities. A lot of it also has to do with what kind of occupations are available for newfound immigrants and how they develop as well. As Trailock said, I'm starting to look at some of the different Western Irish communities, the ones out here in the West, in Oregon, Montana. I'm just starting to look at Montana. I'm going to try to get a grasp on folks in Nevada too. And I'm using the revolutionary period of about 1916 and 1921 to do that, because that really saw a big national mobilization of Irish America. That's really been unprecedented. We didn't really see it, there's nothing like it really before or after, because it was a massive expression of Irish identity and a response to what was seen as a major crisis in Ireland, probably the biggest crisis since the famine. So just in terms of context, at the turn of the 20th century, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom along with Scotland, Wales, and England. She enjoyed democratic representation in the British Parliament and also democratic representation in terms of local government. But a strong majority of Irish people wanted self-government. Many wanted sovereign independence. Others just wanted some kind of self-government known as home rule. Owing to the strength of the British Empire, there seemed very little chance to achieve full independence. That just didn't seem to be on the cards. And the Irish separatists, people who wanted full independence, really didn't have much political power prior to the First World War, because they didn't really seem to have a path to achieving independence. And I'll just pull this up real quick. Instead of what they did was they went into, sorry you guys, that's not it. There we go. They moved into cultural nationalism to foster a distinct Irish identity. And they encouraged the study of the Irish language through the Gaelic League, the taking up of Irish sports, hurling, camogie, football, through the Gaelic Athletic Association. And really what they didn't have electoral representation, but they had a profound cultural influence. And the people who got involved in the movement weren't necessarily the wealthiest or, people who came from a lot of means. They were almost entirely self-made people of limited, modest backgrounds, but they had great imagination, and they experienced a tremendous amount of organizing through all these various cultural activities. And in turn, when revolution did come, they turned out to be absolutely superb first-rate propagandists. And they were able to use imaginative ways of gathering people to their standard for independence, both within Ireland and also abroad, and especially here in the United States, as we'll talk about in a moment. So let's see what else I have. I'll leave it here for a bit. So the First World War profoundly affected Irish politics, just as it did across Europe. When Great Britain declared war on the Central Powers, the Irish public wasn't totally on board with participation in the First World War. Recruiting was low. There was opposition to any kind of attempt to conscript Irishmen to fight in the military. Then in 1916, separatists staged a surprise insurrection in Dublin, which we call the Easter Rising, which was suppressed after 1 week with a number of its leaders executed. That episode galvanized young people. It triggered a kind of a national revival and the emergence of what we'd call the independence movement, much of it coming from this cultural background. And they developed a new political party called Sinn Féin. Their leadership was almost entirely unknown. People of limited means and low status, but they were able to create a mass movement that included a robust women's organization coming on, and also a paramilitary wing called the Irish Volunteers, which was a militia, later known as the Irish Republican Army. In 1918, Sinn Féin won, I think I have a slide for this, swept the 1918 general election, winning virtually every seat outside of the northeast quadrant of Ulster, which was still dominated by Unionists who wanted to retain Ireland to retain her part within the United Kingdom. So after this, the newly elected Irish Republican members of Parliament gathered in Dublin They declared national independence, and they formed themselves into their own national parliament, which they called Dáil Éireann. This self-declared parliament acted in the name of the Irish people and sought international diplomatic recognition for this independent Irish republic. Now, the problem here was Dáil Éireann was an illegal organization. It held no funds. It had no army. And it was trying to defeat the British Empire, which at that time controlled about 1/4 of the world's population. So it was an uphill struggle. The response was the primary strategy to achieve this was first to appeal to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And the Irish thought that they had a really good claim for independence, which was also this peace conference was redrawing the map of Europe. It was creating new countries like Finland and Poland and Yugoslavia and Hungary. And the Irish thought that they fitted the bill. They had a population that wanted sovereign independence, and they had a long-term historic claim to that independence. The problem was Britain vetoed any Irish entry into the conference, and to the surprise of the Irish leaders, the United States government refused to back up this Irish claim. And that was despite the fact that the president of the time, Woodrow Wilson, had brought the United States into the First World War under the idea that the Americans would help an international creation of self-determination for oppressed people around the world. And this idea of democratic self-determination was a core American ideal that it had fought the war over, but that ideal did not extend to the Irish claim, which went against the wartime ally of Great Britain. So that failure at the Paris Peace Conference kind of closed off an option for a peaceful international recognition. So the Irish were kind of left with the idea of building a parallel government within Ireland as part of a massive civil disobedience campaign, where basically ordinary people would refuse to engage with British governance in Ireland. And they would, the Dáil Éireann Parliament, which was illegal, would run its own government functions, its own police force, its own courts, its own taxation system, hopefully, and create this through civil disobedience, discredit British governance in Ireland. And this thing was kind of a propaganda stunt to a certain extent, although it did create an effective boycott of the British courts and the British police force, which were effective in terms of what was going to come next. But this whole effort needed a lot of money. And the Republicans sought that money in the United States, which had a long tradition of supporting and sending funds to Irish nationalists, going well back into the 19th century, into the turn of the century. And part of the idea was to sell bonds, kind of like war bonds, to an international audience. And you buy a $50 bond, and in 10 years you get 5% return on it, and you can cash it out. Although in reality it was a donation. That wasn't really a financial investment process. So this is where Montana comes into the story. Like many parts of the United States, Montana obviously had a significant Irish-American population in 1920, although maybe it wasn't as big as we imagine. In the 1920 census, only 1.3% of the population was born in Ireland, in Montana. There was a bigger foreign-born immigrant population from Canada, Norway, Sweden, Germany, and even England. The Irish-born community was sizable in Butte and Anaconda, 2,300 people in Butte. But there were only 82 Irish-born people in Missoula, for example, 97 in Billings. So the Irish-born, native Irish population was not that significant. It was the second generation, their children and their grandchildren, who had a lot of political and economic influence across the state. Historian Catherine Dowling puts the extended Irish-American ethnic population in Butte at 27% in 1914, which was by far the most Irish town in the state. And these Irish Americans were typically Catholic, and they lived in this kind of Catholic Hibernian ecosystem of churches, schools, charities, hospitals, fraternal and social organizations, which have been active and set up since the late 1880s. And Butte was also a new city without an established kind of Protestant elite, commercial and political elite. So it was its own animal. And it's really these folks, these Irish Americans, who are going to kind of feature in this story. So in 1916, a national organization had been set up in the United States called the Friends of Irish Freedom. And it was a grassroots organization, kind of centrally run, with every state having its own organization, but with some states being a lot more robust than others. So in Montana, the Friends of Irish Freedom had several branches in places like Butte, Helena, Anaconda, Great Falls, Dillon, Bozeman, maybe Missoula. Billings only set up its branch in 1920, so 4 years later. So it's not everywhere. It's really strong in Butte and Anaconda. That's kind of the core of it, and it has kind of these other smaller branches out there. The Friends of Irish Freedom was controlled by really a New York leadership of John DeVoy and Judge Coughlin, who was a Tammany Hall politician. And at the end of the First World War, the Friends of Irish Freedom organization opposed American entry into the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. They also demanded to control funds raised by the Friends of Irish Freedom on behalf of the Irish Republicans. And those were just two of many issues that ultimately led to a break with the Irish Republican leadership. In 1921, there was a split, as there always is in Irish organizations. And there was a successor organization called the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic, the AARIR. And it seemed to have branches in Butte, Anaconda, Great Falls, Helena, Lewiston, Roundup, Billings, Boulder. Apparently, William Fisher reported there were 7 branches in Butte alone. So it's substantial, and it seems to have absorbed pretty much that whole Friends of Irish Freedom network and kind of was reestablished. Both organizations were nearly entirely Irish American in their composition, rather than Irish. And there also doesn't seem to be many people who weren't Irish American within their ranks as well. Both organizations permitted women members, although in Montana they're largely missing from the leadership. And I looked at the Friends and the AARIR in Oregon, and there are quite a number of women involved in leadership positions, and that's missing here in Montana. And I don't really have any easy explanations for that, but hopefully with some research I'll figure it out. Now, in addition to these two organizations, there's another one working for Irish independence. And in Butte, you have a semi-secret body operating under the name of the Robert Emmet Literary Society. It was, in fact, a branch of the Clan na Gael, which was the American wing of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the Fenians. And that was in America, it wasn't quite a secret organization, but it was very much a private organization, and it was dedicated to achieving full sovereign independence in Ireland, and it wasn't opposed to using military force to do so. And Clan na Gael had, Catherine Dowling's identified 2 other Clan na Gael branches in Anaconda and Great Falls, and they seemed to have been raising weapons money and arms money to go back to Ireland for the IRA guerrilla campaign, which was starting to kick off as well. So you have multiple groups across the state, kind of with a core in Butte, raising funds for various reasons, for the Irish independence movement, but under various guises, as I'll explain in a second. So the Montana Irish Support Network included heavy political hitters. So the primary leader was the attorney James E. Murray of Butte, who was later a United States Senator, big New Deal Democrat. Also prominent in organizing was the Helena attorney William Scallon and the Butte merchant John Caplice. And all 3 were upper middle class, professional Irish Americans, kind of the sons and grandsons of, or sons of Irish immigrants. They you see a lot of high-end political support for Irish independence in Montana, much more so than almost any other state in the country. The governor, Sam Stewart, U.S. Senator Tom Walsh, Lieutenant Governor William McDowell, the state Supreme Court justices Holloway, Hurley, and Patton, numerous state legislators. On the left, the political left, you had a number of leading union officials, the socialist Frank Dunn and his radical Butte Daily Bulletin newspaper. The progressive feminist Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin also supported Irish independence before she lost her seat. On the Catholic end, it seems like much of the Catholic Church in Montana was involved in the movement. And when I look at kind of a lot of the meetings and kind of organization stuff, that's what strikes out the number of Catholic priests who were involved. And again, that differs a lot from what I saw in Oregon. And the Catholic bishop of the Great Falls Diocese, Matthias Lenahan, Bishop Matthias Lenahan, was very vocal and quite heavily engaged. However, Catholic Church support for the cause may not have been universal. Although Bishop John Patrick Carroll of the Helena Diocese was the son of Irish immigrants and supported Irish home rule, he seems to have remained aloof from the movement, which may have been potentially too radical or potentially radical for his conservative politics. I'll also point out that Mount St. Charles College, which is now Carroll College, did not invite any of the passing Irish dignitaries to the college. And that was in contrast to a number of Catholic colleges and universities across the United States who would typically bring in someone like De Valera or Mary McSweeney into the college to address the students. So we don't see that in Montana. But we have a pretty broad consensus for Irish self-determination across the state's Irish American community, with also some tensions, which I'll refer to a little bit later. So you would think this wouldn't be that controversial. You know, independence for Ireland, you know, long-standing tradition, popular ethnic minority within the United States. But there are a number of potential problems. First, the Irish Republicans supported Germany in the First World War. So that's a big issue. They were opposed to the Allies, which the United States joined. The Irish nationalist and Irish separatist support network here in the United States had also faced some suppression under wartime sedition laws. A couple of newspapers were shut down, and there was a lot of anxiety about potential Irish saboteurs, including up here in Montana, working on behalf of the Germans. So support for the Irish against the British could easily be seen as treacherous in the volatile, hyper-patriotic environment that immediately followed the First World War. So this relates to our second issue, which is supporters of the United States entry into the First World War championed a really muscular hyper-patriotism, as I'm calling it, and that include opposition to pacifists, to left-wing political ideologies, to kind of radical trade unionists. They also endorse really compulsory Americanization of immigrant populations. And so the Irish weren't racially as problematic as Southern and Eastern Europeans to kind of these nativist patriotic groups. But their Catholic religion created a potential dual loyalty threat. And this was very much perceived as by anti-Catholic activists who were quite prominent and quite kind of mobilizing as a new political force in the United States, or a resurgent political force. So for them, it was objectionable that the Irish Americans supported the Irish independence movement against that great Anglo-Saxon ally, Protestant ally, Great Britain. And this was perceived as ethnically divisive, hyphenated Americanism, Irish American, as opposed to 100% Americanism. And this is kind of the tension of the time. We also, we associate Montana in this period with having a large foreign-born population, a big Irish population, but the state also produced a pretty robust Ku Klux Klan movement from about 1922 onwards, as did a number of the Pacific Northwest states. The Klan here, as in elsewhere, was opposed to a lot of non-white, non-Protestants, but it really didn't like Catholics. And that was a really common mobilizing goal, was to kind of suppress and control a Catholic population that was seen as being insufficiently loyal to the United States. So the Irish also had to avoid portrayals of their movement as some kind of papal overthrow of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant regime in Ireland, which was difficult. So this also occurred during the first Red Scare, when state and federal law enforcement targeted left-wing organizations and trade unions for harassment, arrests, and deportations. And this was a time of global unrest and revolutions, communist revolutions across Central and Eastern Europe. And the Irish also had to avoid being painted as anarchists or as Bolshevik communists, which is exactly what the British tried to do. During the First World War in 1917, Montana had experienced severe labor unrest, official and unofficial suppression. Federal troops were deployed during the Montana lumber strike and the Butte mining strike. The International Workers of the World organizer Frank Little was lynched. And Montana passed its own Sedition Act, which made it illegal to use disloyal language about the government. Some of the Irish American support network within Montana had been vocally against American entry into the First World War, and also included some pretty left-wing politics as well. So the Irish movement in Montana contained elements that were considered unpatriotic and un-American. And so for the Irish Republicans, it was critical to avoid being painted as dangerous subversives without alienating these kind of long-term and effective allies on the political left, especially in Butte. I'll explain this in a second. So what we see in 1919, 1920, and 21 are a series of fundraising and kind of public spectacles and visits by Republican members of the Republican administration coming over from Ireland. Sorry, I lost my thought. Okay, there we go. So the first one of these is really the arrival of Eamon de Valera. So de Valera is a really interesting person. He had his father was Spanish. His mother was a domestic worker, domestic servant in New York. Shortly after his birth, he was returned to live with his grandparents in Brewery in County Limerick, who were poor laborers, lived in a laborer's cottage. But he was highly intelligent, won a series of scholarships, eventually became a mathematician teaching at Maynooth College at the time. He was, or St. Patrick's College in Maynooth. He got involved in the Gaelic League, the language revival. He later joined the Irish Volunteer Militia and achieved a relatively high rank. And during the Easter Rising, he commanded one of the main rebel garrisons. And following the surrender, he was sentenced to death, but had his death sentence commuted. He was elected and kind of the key member of the new Sinn Féin political party. He became the president. And then when Dáil Éireann formed in 1919, he became the president of Dáil Éireann and the parliament. And for that, he was called the president of the Irish Republic. So he's probably the leading statesman of the period among the Irish. And he was quite adept politically. And actually, I'll keep going. So what he tries to do when he comes to the United States is mobilize the Irish-American diaspora, raise funds, and get the diaspora to pressure the American president and the American Houses of Congress to recognize the Irish Republic. This recognized the Irish Republic, which would add diplomatic pressure on Britain to surrender the idea of independence for the country. So he first arrives in Montana on the 26th of July, 1919, and he's coming back from, I'll come back to this picture. That's when he addressed 3,000 Chippewas in Minnesota, and he drew comparisons between their experience and the Irish experience. I'll come back to this in a second. So he undertakes his kind of first tour of the United States shortly after he escaped from prison dramatically in England, and stowed away as a stevedore on a transatlantic liner, and kind of arrived in all his glory in New York, and then went across west out to San Francisco. And what you also often see with Butte is it's a stop for these Republican emissaries on their way west. Everybody goes to San Francisco because it's a big, major political population. They got a lot of political support, and they raise a ton of money in San Francisco. And then there are also similar kind of swings. They always go to Colorado. They always go to Denver. If they're coming up to the northwest, and in California, they'll go down to Los Angeles and some of the other places, Sacramento, San Jose. That's all easy. On their way out, they'll almost always stop at Spokane, sometimes go to Portland, occasionally go to Seattle, but they always make a stop in Butte primarily, but also will spend a couple days, and I'll explain briefly. So just to give you an idea of what happens when he gets to Butte. So the welcome committee was 300 people. The whole city was decked out in green, orange, and white bunting, the colors of the tricolor colors. Tricolors flew from every building in town, every public building in town. There was a big, at the train station, he was put into a car, and they had a big, massive parade through the center of town. A choir of 300 school children serenaded him. He was flanked by Irish-American war veterans in uniform who carried the American flag and the Irish tricolor. And this was a common way of answering this charge of dual loyalty. And the Irish Republicans would often have war veterans who were Irish-American marching and appearing in uniform with the dignitaries as a way of saying that you could be a hyphenated American and still be a loyal American who did their war service. So he has that kind of honor guard. He goes to a massive breakfast for 500 at the Silver Bow Club, which is the playground of the Butte elite, which kind of also reinforces the idea that he's being accepted by kind of the wealthiest and most influential members of Butte society. That evening, he addressed a massive crowd at the old baseball stadium at Hegben Park. At least 10,000 attended. A number of trade unions arranged holidays so their workers could attend the event. And Irish Americans came from across the state. So it was a big, massive crowd as well. He told the gathering that with the common people of the United States rests the hope of the world. They had fought the war for the great American principle of self-determination. If that principle cannot win out, there can be no peace throughout the world. Therefore, both Ireland and America are fighting for the progress of democracy the world over. And this is part of his kind of effort to convince an American audience that support for Ireland was an American value. So it's kind of pushing back against that idea of these guys being dangerous subversives or un-American. So the next day, he goes to Anaconda. He addresses a crowd of 5,000, tours a mine, of course. He returns to Butte that evening, and then he did a special event for the working men and the working women of the city, and this was arranged by the head of the Metal Trades Association, James O'Brien, and it was a kind of a direct and separate appeal to Butte's radicalized workforce. And Dev told the crowd that his late colleague, James Conley, had shown that one could be a good nationalist first and a good socialist second. And now he made some good overtures about the values of labor and trade union support for his movement. But I'll make a quick point that the day before, the Butte labor unions had had a big gathering for the convicted labor radical Thomas Mooney, who was wrongfully convicted of a bombing in California a couple years previously and been sentenced to death. And his mother, who was from Galway, called Mother Mooney, was trying to organize people to secure his release. And that meeting had 8,000 people. And that guy was Irish American, and his mother was Irish. But De Valera didn't mention Mooney at all. And he evaded those kinds of potential landmines because he didn't want to antagonize supporters on either the left or the right. Didn't want to attack the Anaconda mining interests. He didn't want to he didn't want to attack the labor unions. He didn't want to he didn't want to make it easy for somebody to abandon the Irish cause on behalf of some kind of offense that he made. And he does this kind of again and again. The next day, he goes to Helena. He addresses a joint session of the Montana State Legislature. He's accompanied by the governor, Sam Stewart. Galleries and chambers are packed. He cites the connection of Thomas Maher and Montana and Ireland, who's the Montana's second territorial governor and invented the great patriot who had invented the tricolor. He laid a wreath at Maher's statue outside the Capitol, and that was kind of that had been erected by Irish patriotic societies in 1905 and was kind of a symbol of their emerging political might. So this is a pretty major spectacle all around. Dev is treated as a head of state, not as a leader of an underground illegal administration organization in Ireland. But this is not not everywhere is he received this well. The next month, the Seattle City Council withdraws an invitation for him to speak. And that autumn, in Portland, Oregon, the mayor of the city bans the flying of the Irish tricolor. And Dev's car is attacked by war veterans from the American Legion for insulting the American flag. So it's not all Butte Irish marching all around. The receptions can be uneven, but what the Irish do is they tend to go places where they'll be well received and where they have an established network on the ground all ready to go. So Dev comes back a couple months later in November, addresses another crowd of 2,500, has a women's meeting where he emphasizes the Irish support for women's suffrage. And again, this is he appeals to different blocks of potential supporters where he goes. He speaks to women's suffragists. He speaks to trade unionists. But I'll also point out what he omits. So he doesn't take a stand in Butte's union wars, which are escalating and are going to kind of become bloody again in 1920. He didn't call for the release of left-wing activists who'd been jailed in 1919, and those included James Larkin, who was a major figure in Irish trade union politics and had founded the Irish General Transport and General Workers Union, the ITGWU, which was part of the Irish independence movement. He was in jail in Sing Sing, and Dev never mentioned a word about him. And similarly, he doesn't. I showed the picture of his headdress when he talks to the Chippewas, and he's dressed as the Chippewas. Well, he doesn't make any allusions to an alliance between American Indians and the Irish when he comes to Montana, which has a sizable Native American population. Similarly, when he goes to the American South, he makes no mention of African Americans being denied civil rights and voting rights. So he's very carefully trying to avoid potential landmines. He does so relatively effectively, but he's not always taking the most morally courageous stances, as I'll say. But he does generate and help start a lot of fundraising. Here's a little bit of press. And one of the things also about the Irish is these are major press stories. So Dev's arrival, not just in Montana, but his tour across the United States, it's gathering pretty much front page news nearly every day. It kind of falls off the front pages, but it's still a major newspaper. Just as events in Ireland are very carefully followed in the United States. And one of the amazing things is you can pick up a newspaper. Trailock talked about Terrence McSweeney. You can pick up a newspaper in a little tiny town, and they'll have events in Ireland being a leading subject of that, a leading headline. So there's intense interest in what's going on in Ireland, which is relatively easy to follow for an American audience. And again, it's facilitated by the Irish Republicans' superb use of propaganda and the way that they're able to kind of attract an international audience. Where am I going to next? So in order to fundraise, in order to raise political pressure, the Irish, they organized branches of, again, as I said, the Friends of Irish Freedom and later the AARIR. So I don't have all the fund numbers, but in the United States, the Dole loan, as it was called, raised $5 million in 1919. That's worth about $75 million in today's money. The Irish Victory Fund in Montana raised $13,000. That's equivalent to about $200,000. A Butte official claimed that all but $400 was raised in Butte, although I'm not sure if that's true. And then they later raised money on a couple different other funds, an Irish Victory Fund and the Irish White Cross American Relief in Ireland Fund. So there are multiple fundraising drives throughout for the next kind of 3 years. They raised money in kind of various ways. It was almost entirely grassroots organizing. So the different organizations would hold rallies, picnics, a lot of dances, flag days, entertainment nights, public lectures, sporting events. Sometimes there was canvassing of homes and business leaders, almost entirely going towards the Irish. So they weren't bothering with folks who weren't Irish American. For example, the Boulder branch of the AARIR had a membership of 100 members. They canvassed across the valley. They were led by a woman called Helen Wickham. The Great Falls raised $2,000 for the Friends of Irish Freedom Fund in 1920 and $2,500 for the Irish Relief Fund in 1921. And they had 250 paid members in Great Falls. And they used a parish hall, St. Anne's. They had like vaudeville entertainment nights. They had jazz dances. And so there's a whole really rich social component to a lot of this. A lot of the meetings, a lot of the branches would meet every two weeks, maybe every month. And there's, again, it's not just politics, it's also kind of a gathering of folks as well. And they're also very much using Catholic infrastructure, so Catholic parish halls, ancient order Hibernian halls. So like, where do you physically meet? Well, you need it, the auspices of these places are loaned out as well. I do have data for what's called the Irish Relief Fund in 1919. Sorry. So this was funds raised to aid victims of British state violence in Ireland. And I'll explain a little bit more of it in a second. But I have data for this fund, and I have data for all 49 states, and I used the 1920 census for the states to figure out how much dollar per head of population there was. So in California raises, these are just the western states. California raises 9.5 cents per head of population. So for everybody in the state, there's 9 cents is raised for this one fund. You see Montana is 8.2 cents. So that's pretty high. The one that surprised me was Wyoming's quite high too, because I didn't realize there were that many Irish in Wyoming. Although the funds are, anyway. But you see what that means in terms of places like, the Montana total is about 10 times as much head of population as Texas, for example. Washington State and Oregon are about, it's more than double of what they raised in Washington and Oregon, or Arizona or Utah. And then when we look at this state by across the United States, these are the top 13 states of 39. And so Montana is 8th, I think. There you go. Rhode Island's off the charts. they raise 26 cents for every man, woman, and child in the state. Connecticut. But again, it's these, what I'd also say about places like Rhode Island and Connecticut is, it's not necessarily, and Butte kind of falls in this, it's not necessarily the big cities, it's the factory towns. The factory towns are where you raise money, and that's where you have the critical mass, and it's where you have a little bit of the social ethnic infrastructure. And those are the people who open their wallets up. And again, so Montana's doing quite well. And you can see why there's a reason why everybody stops in Montana on their way going east or going west. But what we don't see here are all the other states that are raising almost nothing. And the southern states raise virtually nothing for the Irish Republicans, despite De Valera heading south and later Mary McSweeney. So the demographics of the state have a lot to do with it, and probably the effectiveness of the organizing. So where am I going to go to next? Yeah, I'll kind of jump ahead a little bit. So the Irish organized this civil disobedience movement in their country, 1919 into 1920, but that kind of morphs into a guerrilla war, and led by the Irish Republican Army, and there are attacks on the British police force, which are Irish, had been Irish, but the Royal Irish Constabulary is attacked. The court system essentially collapses. British troops are brought into the country. They're also attacked. And then the British government introduces, led by that political genius Winston Churchill, decides that there are a lot of unemployed British war veterans in England, Scotland, and Wales. How about bringing them into the Irish police force and setting them loose? It's a win-win. And they're known as the Black and Tans, and they're a total disaster. And they institute a series of collective punishment reprisals on communities where IRA attacks take place. And some of those are small scale, but some of them are pretty big scale. So in Cork City, where Trailik and I hang our hat, the Black and Tans burned down, one night they burned down 70 shops and throw 2,000 people out of work, after a policeman is shot. So those kind of reprisal tactics are par for the course. That's how the British Empire retains itself. And it was doing those exact same things at the exact same times in places like Egypt and Iraq, India, targeting civilian populations that supported insurgents. The difference is there was a lot less public appetite for that when you're targeting white people in Europe, and especially white people in Europe who are very well organized, who are superb propagandists and understand how to get their message out. And what they do is they document these atrocities, these attacks by the Crown forces, arsons, killings, tortures, etc., and they publicize them. They publicize them by issuing pamphlets, books, and also by posters and what have you, but also by sending out speakers. And then in Washington, D.C., they hold a series of public hearings under the auspices of a group called the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland. And what they're also doing with all this is they're drawing direct comparisons with German conduct in Belgium in the First World War. And they're doing something similar to what the British did to arouse international condemnation of German conduct against Belgian civilians, which they did quite effectively. They set up humanitarian fundraising funds to disperse humanitarian aid. And it was really, that humanitarian aid was quite politicized. And to raise these funds, they would have survivors talk about their treatment at the hands of the Huns, of the Germans. And in the United States, this really swung public opinion against Germany and paved the way for American entry in the First World War. So the Irish take the exact same example. They set up their own kind of organizations to disperse humanitarian aid. And who could be against humanitarian aid? But what they do is they use this humanitarian assistance as a platform to broadcast the British reprisal policy in Ireland, which is, does not hold up to a lot of scrutiny. So you have a relief fund in Ireland. This is the kind of stuff that they're raising funds for in Montana. The American Committee for Relief in Ireland. And a lot of these committees will have there'll be big national committees, and they'll always have a couple Montana politicians, a U.S. senator or the governor as one of the sponsors. Sorry about that. When they hold these hearings in Washington, D.C. in December, they have all these people come over from Ireland and talk about the worst things that the Irish civilians suffer under this kind of British occupation. One of the witnesses is where is he from? He's a Montana priest who's Irish-American called Father Michael English, who had been ordained at whatever is now, what's the Catholic school in Helena? Yes, thank you. And he seemed to have been, gotten himself all fired up. He appears in a number of these fundraising events in 1919, 1920, and he sends himself over to Ireland where he's an eyewitness to a couple killings of civilians by black and tans. And so he testifies at this hearing. And his testimony is put into pamphlet form with others and dispersed across the global Irish diaspora. And what the Irish do is they have networks of immigrants across the world, not just in the United States, but places like Canada, Australia, South Africa, Argentina, France, Germany. They will translate all this kind of witness testimony, and they do it again to raise pressure on governments to protest British conduct in Ireland. So there's a Montana connection there. The big kind of star of the American Commission hearings is Mary McSweeney. And so she's best known, over here at least, as the sister of Terence McSweeney, who had been the Lord Mayor of Cork, who had died on hunger strike in what was probably the biggest global story of 1920. Because hunger strike, nobody had ever fasted to death on hunger strike in a public way before. And so there was a huge amount of curiosity and human interest around the Terence McSweeney's hunger strike. And he did. After 74 days, he dies on hunger strike. And his sister is kind of his front woman. She's probably the best public speaker the Irish have. She was a suffragist. She had helped set up the women's organization, Coming to Mon. She's elected as a TD, a member of the Underground Parliament in 1921. And she's lights out. And anywhere she goes, she's an absolutely outstanding orator. She comes to Butte in March 1921, speaks to like 4,000 people. Everyone's kind of cheering her on. She also helps generate more funds for the what we call this American Committee for Relief in Ireland. And again, Montana is doing pretty well in terms of the size of the population. So so what I'll just kind of close out. So what we see spectacle of visiting dignitaries who get these tremendous receptions in Montana, which are frequently more elaborate and more celebratory than they get in other parts of the United States. You see, when Dev goes to San Francisco, it's something similar to Butte. When he goes to Chicago, it's something similar to Butte. But it's not like that everywhere he goes. So it kind of really stands out. The frequency with which these Irish emissaries arrive in Montana shows how important Montana is. Montana is definitely on the Irish radar. They recognize not just the money they can raise here, but the political muscle that they're able to muster, and so that's important for them. They're able to, as I said, generate different types of funds which don't just fill the coffers, they also spread the message. A message that Ireland has a just cause for independence, that they are fighting under American ideas, that supporting the Irish cause is patriotic, it's not un-American, and that the alternative is continued British repression, which is, targeting the most vulnerable civilian population. And ultimately, the pressure that these campaigns generate really embarrassed the British government to such an extent that they decided to negotiate with their Irish counterparts. But I'll also say, just kind of finishing out, the one thing I just kind of want to emphasize is, we typically, in the literature anyway, we tend to see this as kind of a celebration, these tours as a celebration of Irish America. Butte, all of its Irish American glory. This occurred in one of the darkest periods of American history, at least modern American history. It was a time of overt racism, anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism. It was all linked. The Ku Klux Klan emerges as a national mass movement the next year, 1922, and they don't just come out of nowhere. These kind of sentiments were very much in existence in Montana and across the American West and across the United States during this exact same period. In places like Butte, this kind of activity, it's relatively easy. It's a safe space. It's recognized as an Irish town, and it's very much an ethnic town where dual loyalty isn't necessarily that big of a deal. But there are other pockets of Irish, especially Catholic Irish, and other parts of the states where you're a lot further out on a limb, where you don't necessarily have that support network, where you might have neighbors who don't really like Catholics, and they certainly don't like big-mouth Catholics talking about American intervening in British political struggle. The same week that Mary McSweeney spoke in Butte, the American Legion held a packed meeting in Madison Square Garden under the banner of one voice, one tongue, one flag, to protest hyphenated Americans trying to drive a wedge between the United States and Britain. It was addressed by the #1 war hero of the day, General John J. Pershing, who objected to foreign-born citizens who attempt to decide American questions for a foreign reason. So this is a frightening time. And there were calls for ethnic Americans, particularly Irish Americans, to lose their non-American loyalties, to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, and get with the program. But despite those dangers, Irish immigrants, Irish Americans chose to speak up during a crisis in Ireland that they felt necessitated a strong response. And they refused to accept the definition of Americanism that required a denial of their ethnic identity, and instead asserted themselves and their rights bestowed upon them by their citizenship. It's easy to keep one's head down, especially when you're an immigrant or a member of a problematic minority group like Catholics in 1920-21 America. Instead, and this is true, what's remarkable though is in Montana and elsewhere, such fears were suppressed and ultimately overcome. Instead, Irish Americans made their sympathies for the Irish independence movement public. They took them out to the street. They paid for them with their hard-earned money. And that took a certain amount of moral courage. And that's something I think we can all appreciate today. So, thank you very much. And I'll take questions if you want. I don't know how we're doing time or whatever.
John?
Yes.
Did the partition of Ireland then divide Irish Americans?
So I didn't really get into it. So the partition's really interesting because Britain was trying to portray the Irish independence movement as on a strictly religious, in a religious way, that it was Catholic Irish against Protestant Irish, and it was an intramural dispute. The Irish Americans overwhelmingly supported Irish unity, didn't recognize that. But, and geez, actually I missed a whole little chunk out of my thing. The British government sent over a number of Ulster Unionist ministers who kind of followed Dev around, and they were received in Protestant churches, especially quite anti-Catholic Irish churches, or American churches. In Billings, I believe, 13 Protestant denominations denounced efforts to mobilize against Great Britain and Ireland in 1920. That included the Methodist Church and a lot of the fundamentalist churches. So kind of in response to this, the Irish set up the Protestant Friends of Irish Freedom, which was, and they also set up the American Voices for Irish Freedom also, which were non-Catholic, non-Irish speakers, so that they could alleviate the religious tension from the debate, but also to try to appeal to people who didn't like Catholics. Because part of the weakness, I mentioned how the movement uses Catholic churches and meeting halls. Well, that also pretty much feeds into the whole idea that there's a secret Catholic movement trying to take over American politics, and that this is a Catholic movement rather than an American, than a movement. The Irish independence movement is a Catholic plot rather than a democratic manifestation of democratic values in Ireland. So that's a constant thing they're battling against, and they undertake a number of techniques and tactics to try to offset that. Yeah.
I went to St. Anthony's Parish. We had our 100th anniversary celebration, and I was given some correspondence between Norman McLean and Father O'Kennedy, who was the founder of St. Anthony's Parish. And apparently at the First Presbyterian Church, they brought up some lady who escaped from Mormonism, but in her talk she bashed Catholics and the plot to take over the United States. And O'Kennedy took on McLean saying, "How dare you? I thought we were friends. How could you possibly do this crap?" And McLean was like, "Hey, back off, man. I had no idea she was going to do that." And it was just this unbelievable dialogue back and forth. They worked it out. But so what you're talking about really is...
Yeah, I think I have one of these. Yeah, they bring a couple speakers in who are Protestants just to address this whole issue. Sorry. Yeah, this guy, Lindsay Crawford, he's a Protestant. They send him out everywhere. He's from Canada. The real issue, waiving for the moment the issue of sectarianism and radical character, which are the chief stock and trade of the Carsonites, the Ulster Unionists. The real issue for the American people goes much deeper than any petty difference due to religious division. So they're trying to fight off against it. They don't need to in some of the really Catholic towns, but when you go to some other places, yeah, they totally need to, because there's a latent anti-Catholicism. They're trying to convince people that, yeah, it's not a papal plot to weaken America. And when you read some of it, I was just reading some of it today. Some of the anti-Catholic stuff is mad, but it's totally common, and it's there. It's really present, and it's part of this whole debate and this whole discourse. Yeah.
Do you have any expertise on the partition as it relates to religion? Specifically, where I'm going, I come across a color-coded map, like the one you had up
Yeah.
there. And more specifically, Furman Island is pretty Catholic to me.
Yeah.
And so did Derry, Derry City.
Yeah.
Why were they part of the partition map?
Because without those population centers, Northern Ireland wouldn't have been viable as an entity. You're right. When they were talking about partition originally in 1914, they were talking about 3 or 4 counties, and had they not brought in Derry and Fermanagh and Armagh, they probably wouldn't have had the troubles in 1969 either, because that's where the nationalist, Catholic nationalist population in those places turned against that, or were against the Northern Ireland government. But when partition occurred, they were seen as necessary to make a big enough bloc that could hold together economically, politically, even though the population of Northern Ireland was about a third Catholic. So not a big enough population that it brought a little bit of economic muscle and labor and what have you, but not so big as to challenge politically the dominant unionism that was there. Yes?
Has Brexit stirred up trouble in Northern Ireland again?
Yeah. Yeah. They're really concerned. People are really concerned in the Republic, and it doesn't seem to have been even given a second thought in the Brexit debate. So yeah, it's a big issue, and we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the consensus is people don't. I mean, one of the things about the Northern Ireland experience was, that war was really unpopular in the South, in the Republic, and people don't want to go back, and people don't want a remilitarized border. They don't want to go back to, divisions. They certainly don't want to go back to paramilitarism, and they're afraid about what's going to happen next. We don't know we don't know how it's going to go. Yeah. The interesting thing about the politics is people are anticipating that the Sinn Féin political party, which is a different version of the Sinn Féin, is probably favored to win and go into power in Ireland in the next government, which is pretty dramatic. But that shows you kind of the transfer, kind of the rapid evolution of politics, not just in Ireland but across Europe, kind of in the last 5 or 10 years. Yeah.
So how long has the British been oppressing the Irish people?
Well, one of the things you'd also emphasize is the Irish having their own hand in it. I mentioned the police force that's there. They were all Irish. So it's the Ireland of 1920 and 1915. There were a lot of people who felt 200,000 Irish people fought in the British Army in the First World War. It's a hell of a lot more than fought for the IRA, or in the War of Independence. 40,000 died. So you have but I'm not saying that there wasn't. It was kind of a British denial of reasonable efforts to determine some kind of self-determination that radicalized the population. And the kind of lesson is, if you have a reasonable request that's based on a democratic value, a population that wants it, and you continue to frustrate and deny a democratic expression, people look for alternative ways. And that's what you saw. You see, and sometimes it just takes a weird political moment, like the First World War and the aftermath, to create an opportunity. So, yeah.
The National Society in Ireland was a very divided society. It was a serious fault line. And when you see David Aaron and Sweden coming out, it's the impression that it was a homogenous group. But it wasn't. And I mean, what we're celebrating is the Civil War. Celebrating, commemorating it.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can on one side the home rule movement, and then the other side the Republican. And the Republican basically, with basic draw most of its inspiration from here in America, the idea. See, these organizations over here in America also, apart from sending over money, it is set up kind of military groups that provide military training.
I saw that Irish volunteer. I was really intrigued by the Irish volunteer thing that you guys had. That was in Butte. I saw some of those papers. I didn't go into them yet. I know that there was the AOH American Alliance, as it was called, was setting up rifle clubs in 1913, 1914. That seems like it's been a straight American thing. That had a little bit of influence in Ireland. Just going back to your original point. So the Irish War of Independence, which is just kind of, big struggle against Great Britain, all this kind of heroism and daring do. It's followed by a civil war between Irish nationalists over the Anglo-Irish Treaty, not a partition, but of whether this new Irish state would be within or without the British Empire. One of the interesting things about this mobilization is it almost completely collapses in the Civil War. There's some support for the Irish Republicans, just a little bit of support for the Irish Free State, some support for the Irish Republicans. I think some of the left-wingers of Butte are sending money over to the Republicans, but it's nothing on the scale of what they raise in 1919, 1920. And so it shows you that, and same is true with the diaspora in Australia and the diaspora in the UK. They seem to have been really, like once the British started burning down Irish villages and homes, that just aroused a real visceral response. And they were able to raise a ton of money. And then once the issues became clouded and they weren't able to kind of figure it out unless you were pretty politically sophisticated or well-read, a lot of people just disengaged because they weren't quite sure. Anyway, I ducked your question anyway.
Well, the question is, suppose, what I'm trying to talk about here is that you have two distinct elements here. You have one, a political physical force, obviously,
Yeah.
and another, an American project.
Yeah.
The whole, what is correct in saying that the Irish Americans, John Devoy, and organized East to West,
Yeah, you can make a good argument.
ambushed the Home Rule Park.
Yeah. But they're also raising money for Redmond, and they're also raising money for the Constitutional Nationalists.
They had been doing since 1870.
Exactly. The great, yeah.
But they weren't going to say, and didn't want to go into coming out of America.
I mean, the big thing with with America is they have an issue because the Irish were pro-German. The Republicans are pro-German, so that makes a huge problem. Like the groundswell. I mean, hell, I don't know if you guys have any memorial stadiums. Is there a memorial hall, a memorial stadium on campus here? Think about Soldiers Field. Think about all the every memorial stadium you can think of around the United States. Those are all First World War monuments. To the war dead. Like, America had never fought an overseas war before. Never fought a war outside the North American continent. It was America becoming an imperialist, joining the imperialist powers, but becoming a global superpower. And the Irish were on a different side of that. So what they try to do is they try to split the difference. Also, I was talking about the use of everywhere these Irish emissaries go, they surround themselves with Irish American war heroes, even though they were supporting the Germans in World War I. Jim Larkin's a paid German agent, so it's a hard. Anyway, we're speaking around, but I don't think we're gonna have an agreement anyway.
No, we're not.
And then the same thing happens in World War II, where the Irish American lobby is very much against American entry into World War II, and they're very much into isolationism. And they're also aligned with the pro-Germans. And one of the things we forget about, it's not as in World War II, we're very much aware of the anti-Japanese American sentiment. In the First World War, the German American population took a hell of a beating. They had mob attacks in the Midwest where they were strong. They had mob attacks and all kinds of suppression of ethnic newspapers and what have you. So the Irish and the Germans are aligned against the British in the First World War and in the run-up to the Second World War. And then once the war starts, that's over. But the impression goes, and so there was an impression after the war in the United States that the Irish were pro-German. Not because necessarily Ireland was neutral in the Second World War, but because of also the fact that a lot of these Irish-American organizations were so against American entry. Anyway. Yes?
How was David Ayres American who were perceived in Ireland by the Irish population and his political colleagues? Like, was there any sort of feeling that he was sort of abandoning the fighting that was going on in Ireland at the time?
No, because it was seen as so critical. They didn't think they could achieve independence without American recognition and American support, and they were actually surprised that it wasn't coming in the first war in the Versailles Peace Conference. They had a big expectation that the Americans were going to advocate, because America also owned all of British war debt. So Britain had a massive war debt to American banks. So the Irish anticipated that Irish American interests would convince the Americans to deliver Irish independence. What they underestimated was the fact that Americans were interested in American interests, and Irish interests were much further down the list.
With a history teacher there, the reason for entering into the First World War was that if the Brits lost, we would have to use the economy because the loans were so high. But the interesting thing about David Ayres, he was an American citizen.
Absolutely. Born in New York, and and his mom continued to live in New York. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So at the time you were talking about, you mentioned like the mining strikes, lumber strikes, Montana.
Yeah.
It's also the time of like a lot of unrest, especially in coal-producing areas.
Yeah.
Did Dale ever visit? You mentioned Colorado, but did you visit West Virginia, West Battle, Blair Mountain? Did you visit Ludlow
he visited Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. He visited, I don't know about Virginia. See, there wasn't a Catholic population there necessarily, or an Irish population, but he was definitely in the coal fields in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I mean, like, what's striking, I think, Seattle and Portland, Seattle has this general strike, and there's hostility to him because he's seen as potential, he's seen as potential radical. He goes to Los Angeles, he's going to speak at the, maybe the Masonic Stadium. It's a big venue in LA anyway, it's like a 20,000 seater, and they pull the permit at the last minute, and the Los Angeles Times calls him a Bolshevik. So they're seeing them as potentially aligned with these labor radicals who are at their kind of one of the things that are most kind of violent in 1918, 1919. Yep. Yes.
So you mentioned that General Pershing kind of gave an anti-Irish speech in New York. Was he the same one who commanded the federal forces when they intervened in Butte?
What year was?
I can't remember the year, but I think he was the one.
It would not surprise me. It would not surprise me.
Omar Bradley. Captain Omar Bradley.
Oh, really? That's funny. Yeah. And there's another guy, Admiral Sims, who's the big American naval war hero, and he calls the Irish jackasses. They're hyphenated jackasses. Or they're zebras. He calls them zebras, but in fact they're jackasses because they don't know if they're American. They pretend to be American, but they're something else entirely. So these are, again, Pershing and Sims are the two biggest war heroes of the day, and they totally are against this, because they're also against, the Irish are against a new alliance between the United States and Great Britain after the war. Okay, I think I'm going to end it there because my voice is going. And I'm going to be in Butte tomorrow.
Thank you all again so much, and we're going to try and get a few more speakers out over the next couple of months and so forth, and get together here and sit some in and listen to some of the lecturers and speakers that will share their knowledge with us. So thank you all so very, very much, and I hope to see you all again. If any of you want to join the Friends of Irish Studies, come up here and talk to these 4 fine people. Or if you want to go to Ireland, you can support our raffle. $5 a ticket or book a 6 for 25. It'll give you a little taste of heaven. Good to meet you in the Mahagat. Thank you all so very much. Thank you so much, Scott. You are a gentleman, Scott.